The first alternative, metaphysics. Alternative cultures come into existence when humans find themselves in an irrevocable disagreement with the world. For this reason, today's individuals with an alternative view cannot be seen as the inventors of the alternative. They are not the first ones to have their discontent with the world become confident and fundamental. In order to understand the meaning of alternative culture in a more radical sense, we must dig around in the submerged layers of our tradition of ideas. If we go back a few millennia, the archaeological dig for traces of an old protest against the world will make a find. There we encounter sediments containing the beginnings of high forms of religion and metaphysical interpretations of the world. What metaphysics presents as a philosophical phenomenon is not up for discussion. So too its basic conceptual structures and the variants of its architectonics are of no concern to us at this moment. Metaphysical statements made by humans are only of interest to us insofar as a crucial chapter in the prehistory of discontent with the world connects to their emergence. We interpret the appearance of metaphysical forms of thought as an indication of the increased need for harmony and abstraction in the face of increasing social and existential dissonance. In this respect, metaphysics could not be separated from its pathogeneses out of the malaise in the high cultures. To convince ourselves, it suffices to see how the most painful, fundamental experiences of human existence are hidden beneath the fabric of fundamental metaphysical words. The One, substance, reason, God, logos, cosmos, soul, immortality, idea, order. Admittedly, they are experiences that always appear within the pure text of metaphysics as something that has already been overcome. The purpose of the pure text is to report the success of metaphysical harmonization efforts. In it, we can already hear the logical triumphs of consciousness over the dark, hurtful world. As people of today, we can no longer easily understand the texts of such victory reports because we have come to use different weapons from the old metaphysicians in our battles against world weariness. But if we go back to the fundamental experiences through which metaphysics was first crystallized, we can see how metaphysics emerged as the very core of the first alternative cultures. These experiences are probably inaccessible to today's everyday consciousness at first, but they are available to contemporary conscious life at the very least when it comes to situations where treatments from modernity's pharmacy are no longer helpful. Ironically, the modern-day crisis includes involuntary access to the metaphysical attempt at world management. After all, we are watching, with a perplexity that befits primal peoples rather than late cultures, an age of a second helplessness emerge on the passive side of modernity's status as a jack of all trades. As a result, the present time, which is philosophically based on its fundamentally post-metaphysical position, has created a piquant community of experiences, with the old metaphysics kindling world conditions. The threats that loomed over the world at the end of the metaphysical era reveal its beginnings as well, so much so that restorations seem inevitable. One glance at the New Age scene in North America and Central Europe gives the impression that we are dealing with a gigantic remake. A holistic consciousness industry has emerged on both sides of the Atlantic, and it lives on metaphysical plagiarism. To put it more amicably, countless contemporaries spontaneously quote from early metaphysical sources to articulate aspects of their current feelings about the world. They deem it necessary to skip over several millennia to find answers for their own questions. A portion of modernity must fall back on archaic speeches to say things for which no usable modern words exist. What questions are we referring to? I will only discuss two here, which were essential in motivating the upsurge of thinking towards metaphysics. The inequality between different fates in life, and the fear of all-devouring time. As for the first of these experiences, it was brought into language through the classical verses of the young Hugo von Hofmannsthal. One could add with the mild, somnambulist cynicism that is sometimes the privilege of poets. Many will of course have to die down there, where the heavy oars of the ships sweep. Others reside above near the helm, aware of the migration of the birds and the land of the stars. This poetic meditation aims at balancing the inequality of destinies by ways of a metaphysical world housekeeping. On that higher level which constitutes the scene of metaphysical movement, everything is both closely linked and haphazardly connected to everything else. Thus the misfortune of the one comes together with the fortune of another in a sublime harmony. But a shadow falls from those lives across and into the others' lives, and the light are bound to the heavy, as the air is bound to the earth. Through an awareness of connection, an evident scream to the heavens becomes music to the metaphysician's ears. This desperate need for music is driven by the evidence that human destinies are unstoppably unequal, and that there is no compensation for this inequality on a human level. Without a doubt, this experience points to the emergence of hierarchized, large-scale societies, and the separating of the fate of those at the top and those at the bottom. From there on out, the social world appears like an enchanted galley where rowing slaves perish below deck, while a comprehensive view develops above, in which the misery of others is redeposited into the harmony of the whole. Many fates weave alongside my own. All are interconnected by a common existence, and my part is more than simply this life's slender flame or narrow lyre. The metaphysical impulse demands that thinking make this climb out of the inequality and confusion of life into an order-creating contemplation. And insofar as efforts towards order of this kind simply belong to the very nature of thinking, we can never entirely eliminate the metaphysical or cosmic holdings on the activity of the mind, unless this activity were willing to become as incomprehensible and confused as the reality it works on. But then we would lose the difference between mind and reality, and confused de facto existence would no longer relinquish any work to the mind. Some mystics have indeed taken this path of indifference, but for metaphysical thinking its task is entirely unambiguous, to show messy life the pathways that lead to order. For us, the claim to validity of the old metaphysical cosmic ideas of order fails because of a simple logical distinction. An ordering contemplation is not the contemplation of order per se. Music and metaphysics rise up against the noisy physics of life as an unstoppable first alternative, because the will to order is at the very root of the entire impetus. Metaphysical study turns away from the desolate surface of things and looks down into depths or up into heights from where intelligible order shines towards us, if we are willing to look away from the all-too-visible and not see through the intrusive glow. In order to advance to such order, the not-yet-refined eye and the not-yet-spiritualized ear must shift to more abstract forms of hearing and seeing. To seeing with the third eye, hearing with the third ear. This alternative, metaphysical seeing and hearing, is always already an overseeing and overhearing as well. A hearing all the way to the end, and a seeing through, a not listening, and a looking away. A right hearing and seeing. An inner listening and a seeing inward. The metaphysical break with the superficial world of appearance grips the organs of perception first. To ensure the effective order, they have to spiritualize themselves and withdraw from the gross turbulence of what is present and existing. With that, the first step into an enlightenment is made. It leads to a culture of transparence, where all existing things shift from the state of being naturally lit, or shaded, to that of a logical transillumination. Thus the analytical mythos moves into its invasive phase. The analytical mythos no longer sees the world as a sovereign play of light and dark onto illuminated, non-luminous things. Instead, it becomes the object of constant transillumination, where a permanent intellectual light pierces through fleeting phenomena to reach eternal structures and bring them to definitive determinations. There are grounds for suspecting that the history of nihilism begins with the advent of such transillumination ontologies. If so, this history would be identical to the fate of analytical rationality, which sees right through the facts to grasp their cause, through appearances to see their essence, and through structures to understand their function. This suspicion contradicts the vulgar idea of nihilism that sees the phenomenon as a modern affair and derives it from the collapse of the metaphysical sphere. In reality, what has gone by the name of nihilism for 100 years could only be the latest explication of the basic nihilism that was inherited in the trans-illuminating, backwards-leading, and, from presently tangible appearances, refraining rationalizations of the world since their emergence. Next to the irremediable affronts on thinking by the mysteries of inequality and dissonance, the experience of death and temporality by all individual life plays a decisive role in the emergence of metaphysics. Essentially, they form one complex, and time and death are not two different experiences, but a single experience that consists of temporality. The eventual death of all individual life is already implied in the fact that everything real seems to exist within time, and that nothing living can escape the decay that comes with the passing of time. Whatever exists in the passing of time must suffer from the illness of becoming and the injury of passing away. Whoever is born in the passage of time owes a death to nature. The Greek myth of Kronos, who devours his children, captures this idea in its pervasive morbidity. It speaks of life bound to time as fateful self-consumption. This idea of time has defined the Western civilizing process, and modernity has advanced this fall into time, first registered by the old metaphysics, to a consummate chronolatry, to quote Massimo Cacciari's Baroque term for the modern cult of time. But what is obscured by the contemporary dictates of clocks was glaringly obvious in the early metaphysical experience of time. Chronos, the passing of time, is fundamentally a period of suffering, lack, failure, a deadline for the inevitable undoing of life. Older metaphysical thinking was aware that the time of Chronos moves directly towards death. Metaphysics, Christian metaphysics above all, understood that, being mortals, we are zombies, the living dead, walking around in their own corpses with the ghastly pretense of being alive. Indeed, this perspective forces itself to be accepted by a thinking that has conceived of all individual life as falling prey to all-consuming time. Those who conceive of life as occurring within time and understand time as an indomitable process do not only see themselves as continuously dying, but must also imagine themselves already as those who will have died. Together with their physical and moral being, they fall victim to Chronos, not just in retrospect, but at the outset. Life must cope with this outrage if it has understood the predicament of time and its universality. From that point on, one of the fundamental questions of conscious life is how it can cope with its irreversibility. Full of horror, the one who can imagine the passage of time with respect to their own existence will see their own flesh fall from their bones. Flesh and bones that are already no longer really one's own, but that we have been dispossessed from. But that we have been dispossessed of from the outset by all-devouring Chronos. There is a reminder of the kind of shock brought on by the sight of the ephemeral in the Buddhist legend that tells of the first time that Gautama ventures outside of his father's protective palace and sees with his own eyes the suffering nature of life falling prey to time in the form of a sick person, the beggar, and the deceased. The shock penetrated so deeply that thereafter the young man no longer wished to have his own eyes so they could captivate him with the deadly play. He wanted to detach himself from the sense of sight and what it perceived both at the same time. He wanted to detach himself from the sense of sight and what it perceived, both at the same time. Emil Cioran is a witness to this kind of feeling in our time. In a text called Paleontology, he records the shudders of an unredeemed metaphysician when confronted with the flesh. An unforeseen shower one autumn day drove me into the Museum of Natural History for a while. I was to remain there, as a matter of fact, for an hour, 2 hours, perhaps 3. It has been months since this accidental visit, and yet I am not about to forget those empty sockets that stare at you more insistently than eyes. That rummage sale of skulls, that automatic sneer on every level of zoology. Nowhere is one better served with respect to the past. Here the possible seems inconceivable or cracked. One gets the impression that the flesh was eclipsed on its advent, that in fact it never existed at all, that it could not have been fastened to bones so stately, so imbued with themselves. The solidity, the seriousness of the skeleton. It seems absurdly provisional and frivolous. It flatters. It gratifies the addict of precariousness I am. And that is why I am so comfortable in this museum where everything encourages the euphoria of a universe swept clean of the flesh. The jubilation of an afterlife. Flesh and bone stand in ontological opposition to each other. While the flesh obscenely passes away, a promise of eternity belongs to the essence of bones. With cynical self-sufficiency, the bones perform metaphysics' rejection of this temporary life. Grinning, they bode beyond flesh and transience. A gaze that looks upon the disease of life and remains unshaken can only emerge from empty eye sockets. Thus, metaphysics and cynicism come into being from the same impulse. The first as an overcoming of the temporal through an ascent into timelessness, and the second as a sarcastic lingering of consciousness in what is fleeting, what is null and void. Together, cynicism and metaphysics speak about this ridiculous life with the humour of destruction. The symbol of bones shows how metaphysics' alternative to the ephemeral took shape. This alternative looks through the ominous fiction of the flesh all the way to the bony substance, to the very skeleton of life which continues to exist as a time-superior residuum. But bones only function as parables for last principles, since they too are mere apparitions that can be reduced and converted to their nothingness. In the past it was fire that took on the work of metaphysical alchemy, distilling the imperishable. Distilling the imperishable from perishable life. Whatever has gone through fire has overcome this final breakdown. What remains is imperishable essence. In the end, nothing remains from living bodies that lasts, only ash and spirit, dust and weightlessness, mineral and light. This is the substance that eternity is made of. In its last distillates, the ravenousness of time breaks down. By means of an extreme reaction, the imperishable is filtered out from the murky and volatile elements. Thus we can see how the old metaphysics sought to cope with the irreversibly oriented toward death. It answered the question about an antidote to transience with eternity. Its answer to the question of overcoming death was immortality. These answers were enforced as the irreversibility of life processes could no longer be compensated by older cyclical concepts that had sufficed for a mythical interpretation of the world. Cyclical thinking only has a chance in the life forms where world changes in linear time can be pronounced by myths of nature as never having happened. It is only in the mythic circles of nature that life is annually reborn as if nothing irrevocable, irreversible, inseparable had ever happened. However, in historical mobilized cultures, time's arrow flies irrevocably forward. In them, the irreconcilability of the fates and the transience of living conditions becomes overwhelmingly evident. They can only be processed with metaphysical strategies. The metaphysical alternative, with which most of the continuances of modernity are still impregnated, contains the primordial history of human dissatisfaction, with a lapsed world fallen prey to time. With a lapsed world fallen prey to time. Radical metaphysics knew that only a radical overcoming of this reality can be its remedy. Only that which transcends life can make it bearable, and thus metaphysics responded to the sickness of life with its witty self-cremation. Passionately, it sought the reduction of reality to its time-superior residues in matter or in spirit. It countered sickly flesh with serene bones, the burning wound with cooling stone. The metaphysical alternative has above all expressed itself consummately in the erection of stone monuments, towering works of rock, menhirs, pyramids, temples, gates, obelisks, columns, towers. Towering works of rock physically represent the ideals of law, permanence, and divine finality. Some of this Egypticism can still be found in the skyscrapers of New York, Chicago, and Hong Kong. In its architectures, metaphysics illustrates the thesis that the wound of time is healed only by eternal stone. In stone, the physical itself gains metaphysical content. The metaphysical exercise works ceaselessly towards a mineralization of the soul. Only those who discover within themselves the inert wisdom of the stones have found the philosopher's stone. Thus the yearning to turn to stone lends an Eleatic trait to the metaphysical need for validity. For those unable to make peace with impermanence under any circumstances, there is no greater promise of salvation than the one that lies in the discovery of the immobile. And this is why God is philosophically called to the unmoved mover. To become similar to him, or to restore a lost resemblance to him. The radicals of the first alternative were happy to use impossible means. Whether they went into the desert to become a grain of sand, of eternity, in an ecstasy of loneliness, let themselves be walled in alive, to force a standstill of the absolute with the ultimate rejection of movement, or prove with crushing logic that the flying arrow stands still in the air. Each time the Eleatic effect is at play, the desire to see through false movement in order to enter into true immobility. The authentic old metaphysics abhors what moves, teems, mixes, circulates, but above all the revolting food cycle that requires movement and violence of the highest degree. Eat and be eaten. It is this bestial macrobiotics in particular for which metaphysical movement phobia seeks a remedy. Only a static alternative can free human existence from its movement in the direction of death. Therefore, the misery of life can be simultaneously overcome by overcoming its movement. Hardly any metaphysicians of the old kind would shy away from the thesis that only the immobile could be good, whereas everything else, all greed, lack of freedom, fear, violence, misery and exploitation moves, whether on legs, wheels, through automation or with motor engines. For a few centuries now, the immobilizing effect has been exhausting itself in Europe. As a result, metaphysics of the older kind has become impossible. Since being is thought of as a verb, and the subject is thought of as an activity, ontology in its classical form is no longer tenable. Even modern science has devoted itself to a concept of movement according to its mode of operation, namely that of research. When it comes to Hegel, the suspect movement has conquered metaphysics itself and made eternity get a move on. Meanwhile, Kronos devours not only his children, but also the timeless magnitudes which we once thought to have evaded his appetite. We reside in such a penetrating de-eternalization and mobilization that we are not able to speculatively conceive of an opposite concept to the dominant concepts of movement and event. 2 centuries were all it took to use up the immobilistic reserves of a world age. A cult of movement without historical precedents has enveloped modern thought and agency. It sees all that stands still, holds on, relies on itself, and rattles unused as ridiculous. As if it had to recover from a long illness, modernity has broken away from its rigidity enamoured former times, and now enjoys its new power to evaporate all that is solid. Nowadays, only real estate brokers believe in immovable property. However, disestablished eternity casts a long shadow over the great dynamization epochs. Modernization visibly attacks the old world basis of existence and does as much violence to the primary courses of life through increasing mobilization as the most raging immobilization. Modernization visibly attacks the old world basis of existence and does as much violence to the primary courses of life through increasing mobilization as the most raging immobilization. Thus a discontent grows out of the civilizing process and calls forth new alternatives. Does metaphysics thereby return? Do the Egyptian and Eleatic motifs once again have a chance? Are the apostates of modernity once more seeking the exit from earthly confusion and cosmological order? Was the collapse of the old metaphysics through the attack of modern concepts of activity not definitive? Or was that first static metaphysical alternative perhaps not the only way to disagree with the world? Is there another alternative that does not have to end up in stone, purity and self-mortification in order to cope with the transience of life?